As I mentioned, thanks again for the invitation. I think this has been an excellent conference so far. So, as mentioned, my name is Nenad Nevajda. I'm a PhD candidate on a part-time basis with Carleton University in the Ethics and Public Affairs program. Full-time, full disclosure, I'm a public servant, so I am currently employed with Export Development Canada, and I just wanted to disclose that this presentation is from my personal capacity and shouldn't reflect. It doesn't reflect the thoughts or opinions of Export Development Canada or the federal government. So before, I guess, delving into my presentation, which, as you could see in front of you, is related to corruption and positioning corruption as a property, as an emergent property of a complex system, I just wanted to give maybe a little bit of background in terms of how, and a bit of a bio, I guess, in terms of how I came to both be interested in corruption research, but also complex systems. So I think I'm really arriving at this topic from a practitioner level. Corruption for me has been something that I've been involved in professionally for a number of years. I have a background in a bachelor's and a master's, both in international relations, international business, and law. And my early career started off involved in investor state arbitration. So working for a law firm that represented companies that were taking governments to court for various different reasons. And as part of that work, there was a lot of research that I was involved in terms of, actions conducted by, I guess, public institutions at various different levels of government. And there was in some of these cases, there was these elements of corruption. So that really got me kind of interested and intrigued in the phenomenon, which, unlike other types of, I guess, criminal behavior, has a very political and social aspect to it, which I found very interesting. I really like to look at problems from a very wide lens. And then over time, I had different stints in the public sector, including in municipal government here at the City of Ottawa, and currently with the federal government through the Crown Corporation Export Development Canada. And in that capacity as well, I'm involved on a day-to-day basis, involved in business integrity measures and ensuring compliance with financial crime legislation and laws. But in all of this, corruption was very interesting for me from an academic perspective, and I got into more and more sort of analyzing from an academic perspective what corruption is. And the really interesting thing that I found was that when you open up any paper or book or any kind of literature on corruption, I think usually in the first few sentences, the author would describe corruption as a complex problem. And it never really dawned on me until a few years into kind of the academic side of things that, why is nobody really looking at like this what is complex about it? And so that kind of really got me down the path and got me sort of open my eyes to this world of complex adaptive systems. And what I'm really looking to do in my research, and again, it's very early stage, so many of the topics I'll be presenting here today are still very, in hypotheses, so to speak, and still works in progress. But what I really wanted to do was just really look at corruption from a complex perspective, so from the ground up. Unlike a lot of practitioners, they describe corruption as a complex problem, but they don't really, they still conceptualize it in the conventional terms that we do today. So that's just a little bit of a background and bio on myself before I jump into this presentation, which, as again, I'll just mention is about conceptualizing corruption as an emergent property of a complex system. So today, the dominant view of corruption is defined by organizations such as the World Bank, Transparency International, but it's also embedded in quite a lot of different legislative instruments globally. It really boils down to this definition, which is abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And below in this graphic, I tried to kind of visually represent what that really looks like. Is you have basically two actors. One on the left side is the corruptor. So this is the person that induces the corrupted to do something to provide some kind of benefit. Now, usually when we hear about these events, through news media or through case law, there's some kind of exchange of value, usually money, but it could be other things for that benefit. The interesting aspect of all of this is that eh, corruption occurs when there's this entrusted power, and usually we associate that with public power. So when we think about it, we're thinking about procurement official that works for a government department or for a university department or for a health unit, who accepts a bribe and awards a contract. I think that's the most classic case of what we think about when we think about corruption. And that's all well and good, and I think it served a purpose for policymakers for a long period of time. But in the last several years, there's been more and more questions about, if we are so comfortable and knowledgeable about what corruption is, why have many of the efforts, the anti-corruption efforts, both locally and globally, ultimately failed? And there's been a lot of money spent on anti-corruption efforts, particularly in the developing world, through institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, who have tried to curb corruption in these regions. And when you think about some of the measures that we have on corruption, such as Transparency International, there really hasn't been that much change over the years since we've been doing these kinds of metrics in terms of countries improving their status or countries, maybe sliding backwards. It's been very little movement. So there's been certain questions in the media, or in the academia, should I say, but also in the media, about whether this contemporary view of corruption, which in this slide is really has three kind of features. One is that corruption is a principal agent problem, in that the agent of a public institution, who's the principal, they are the ones that get corrupted by external third parties, and this is really what corruption means. It also presupposes a very rational actor model, which includes just basically a calculation of opportunity, risk, and reward. So really, instances of corruption, there's a calculus that's done by both individuals, the corruptor or the corrupted, and that's really the determining factor on whether corruption will take place. And then the third component, which ties into a lot of the sort of failed anti-corruption efforts, has been the feeling that the best way to combat corruption is through compliance and enforcement mechanisms, so such as codes of conduct and codes of ethics, but also just general sort of legislative and statutory and criminal code provisions that prohibit certain activity. And not to say that these aren't very important sort of tools in mitigating corruption, but nonetheless, they have, when you look at things empirically from an anti-corruption effort, they haven't really been that effective. And so as a result of these factors, there's been more and more sort of academic work coming out questioning the dominant view of how we conceptualize corruption. So this passage here from Bo Rothstein's recent book, Controlling Corruption, he takes a really social contract approach, but I think he sort of epitomizes the challenges that we've had. And again, there's elements and components of this, while not referencing complex systems, that when we read them, they're really referring to corruption, again, being this complex phenomenon. So in his view, he admits, and I think there's very many people that admit, that corruption is not a very simple thing. It's not this issue of you have a corrupt agent and a corruptor, but rather it's very resilient. Corruption sometimes also well organized and well entrenched. And the fact that most of our efforts have been to as noted in this passage, can be remedied if an honest principal changes the incentives for his or her dishonest corrupt agents, they will find that there's a rational self-interest to stay away from corruption. So this is a very, very economics dominant view of how to deal with anti-corruption. And again, more and more sort of academic work is coming out to suggest that perhaps this is not the best way. So in my research, I've been trying to really understand how corruption has been portrayed historically, and corruption is not a new phenomenon. It dates back to, you know, antiquity. The moment, I guess, from when society started to become more complex and started to organize into social systems. I would argue that this is when corruption also began. So um, historically, and for most of human history, we viewed corruption in a different way. So corruption derives from the Latin corrumpere, which really refers to a debasement or a change for the worse. It's supposed to invoke a moral depravity. And Philip Eubin, in a really interesting paper in 1978 on political corruption, really sort of narrows it down to it being really a debasement of the foundations and origins of a political community. And so, looking at corruption in those more holistic terms, what really the takeaway for me is that it is a property of a system, rather than a individual discrete act between two individuals for their own private or personal gain, which I think is what much of the sort of corruption um, literature and much of our anti-corruption efforts are predicated along is that we have rational actors that are in self-interested ways trying to gain an advantage. And even here, I think there's in the sort of rational Homo economicus view of people, there's been quite important advancements in behavioral sciences that really are pinpointing to that, people and agents and systems and institutions and organizations are generally not rational actors. Like, they may be in certain instances, in other instances they may act irrationally. So it's just something that, when we think about historical thought on this, going back again, to Plato, to Aristotle, all the way to the Middle Ages with Machiavelli, a lot of these sort of philosophers thought about corruption in a very different way than we do today. So going a bit further now, closer to my research. So what sort of academia has been, or academic thought has been put and linked to complexity and corruption? Well, not a lot. So there's been a few authors here and there that have really taken a look, accepted the fact that, corruption is a complex phenomenon, and really taking it further than people have in the past, but it's still not very much at the foundational level of conceptualizing corruption as a complex phenomenon itself. It's more along the lines of maybe using network theory and network analysis to, analyze a set of bidders on a contract in a specific market, and detecting patterns of sort of collaboration between these agents to obtain favorable terms on a contract, which again is a very, very useful research, but the conceptualization of corruption is still under the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. There's a couple of authors in particular I've listed here: Petra Hiller, who's a European researcher, and Lawrence Lessig, who is and some of you may be familiar because he ran as a single issue candidate in a recent US election. They really actually get closer to the spirit of looking at corruption as a complex phenomenon. So Petra Hiller, for example, she's heavily influenced by Nicholas Luhmann and his theories of differentiation in society. And, as society gets more complex, different functions of society become sort of their own sets of systems. So for example, we have a political system, we have a economic system, we have a lobbying system, and so forth. And so Petra proposed this really interesting definition of corruption, or conceptualization of corruption, which was that corruption occurs when these different systems influence one another, and that influence causes this deviation of a purpose of each one of those systems. So a classic example of that would be, the political system being influenced to do something via lobbying by the business system, or the system of businesses involved in private business. So for Professor Hiller, that would be sort of an indication that corruption has taken place. Lawrence Ressig, he really proposes a very institutional view of corruption, and the really interesting aspect, and I think is probably one of the most influential papers on me in terms of going down this path of looking at corruption from a complex systems perspective, is that he defines institutional corruption that can occur even if the agents in that system don't don't take illegal action or even are unethical. So for example, you know, his classic example, I guess, would be lobbying in the United States. So certainly there's illegal types of lobbying that occur, and people are, are put to trial, and they're tried under the criminal code or the civil code. But there's also quite a lot of legal lobbying that's fully sanctioned and potentially even ethical, yet the effects on the system and the institution as a whole render it corrupt. And so that's a very, very interesting aspect, because it's really closely related to some of the sort of features of a complex system, which is the sort of activity at the agent level doesn't necessarily reflect what is happening at the sort of macro level of that system or the institution in this case. So again, there's a little bit of activity in this space from an academic perspective of really trying to link complexity with corruption, but it's few and far between, and most of the time the papers don't really kind of refer to complex adaptive systems. They describe complex adaptive systems themselves, but again, it's the field is still very stuck, I guess, in the more conventional view of defining corruption as again, abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So for me, when I started going down this path and looking at some of the key features of what a complex system is, and then trying to look at it, do these features exist when we talk about corruption? I was finding that, of course they do. So, some of the key aspects of a complex system are the many interactions. So yes, while, on the flip side, when we think about corrupt events, we may be thinking that maybe there's one person has bribed another person to obtain a contract, but in reality, there's a whole host of interactions that have happened behind the scenes, maybe not visible to many, which is a problem generally of investigating corruption, is that it's very it's taboo, and so it's often conducted behind closed doors, and it's not very open to sort of analysis. But even still, most events of corruption are not sort of singular interactions between two people. It involves quite a significant amount of interactions that enable this corrupt event to even occur. For sure, emergence is another practice that when you look at sort of corrupt events or corrupt systems, there will be indications that at the micro level, the corrupt conduct doesn't necessarily need to translate that the entire institution is corrupt, or vice versa. The nemesis is very, very relevant as well. So there's many examples where, particularly at the organization level, at the corporate level, for example, you see institutions that are seen as very sort of ethical, so to speak, or law-abiding with integrity, and then they devolve into corruption, or vice versa. So I think a good example would be, the Arthur Andersen case in the United States several years ago, tied to the whole Enron scandal, where Arthur Andersen was seen as this sort of the most integrity intensive of the big sort of accounting firms, and then over time it just fell into this disrepute of corruption and fraud, and eventually it was no longer around. The concept of self-organization is there as well, so it's very difficult to determine a ringleader or sort of a controlling mind of corruption events, even in very widespread corruption events. So for example, the case, the Lava Jato case in Brazil, that was quite significant and widespread throughout Brazil, involving many different actors. There was never a sense that there was one or several individuals that controlled everything and organized everything. Rather, it just permeated through the system based on the different interactions that occurred and the different way that different subsystems in that society were set up. Interesting as well, corruption is very adaptive. a really good case of that is when we think about police corruption. So, you know, almost like clockwork, you look at certain police departments in New York City, almost every 20, 25 years, there's a different commission of inquiry involving police corruption. So the institution is the same, yet, and there's these calls for reform that yet over time, there's the corruption manifests itself in different ways and adapts to different conditions within that system. Certainly, non-linearity, I think, is as we've talked about in previous other presentations, is present as well. So institutional developments unrelated to corruption can lead to systemic corruption. I think a really interesting case there is, tying into Lawrence Lessig's work is the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in the United States. There's been other decisions, but this one in particular is kind of like the one that most people refer to in terms of allowing, you wouldn't be able to say that the Supreme Court had corrupt intent to rule the way it did in the Citizens United case, but the effects of that ruling had this pervasive effect on politics and on lobbying and the types of actors that can lobby and the distorting effects that they can have on a democracy, which could have these very, very large effects, negative effects that may amount to corruption. And feedback loops as well. As I think it's tied to non-linearity, the fact that potentially certain corrupt events can beget more corrupt events, and it ends up being a systemic corruption event that permeates all of society. And I think the final other sort of aspect of it was when you think about signal flows in complex systems, it's really about information flows and definitely, while there's mediums of exchange for specific criminal acts, when it comes to corruption, the information flows within a system is what allows corruption to permeate. So, when I was looking at my research and looking at some of these features of complex adaptive systems, it totally made sense to me that this was really a sort of a novel way to look at this problem, and perhaps it would have sort of novel applications when it comes to policy. So where does that lead to today? I'm just having a look at my clock here. What I've been really trying to do, as I mentioned, is that I've been trying to conceptualize corruption from the ground up in complex terms. And so this is a working definition right now. Probably we'll change and adjust, but it really boils down to, corruption being the result. So it's really a consequentialist aspect when there's an emergent influence, which can be legal or even ethical, but that undermines an institution's effectiveness. And that undermining can not just be, from a practical terms that the institution isn't able to carry out its activity, but it could also relate to the public's trust in that institution. So I think these are several of these aspects, and we don't really have time to unpack it all, but really kind of hearken to that complex adaptive systems aspect. And this is really what I wanted to do with my research, was to really, propose a definition of corruption that is built in complex systems terms. So what does that mean? And in terms of, my research, particularly this field, there's very many different aspects that I could be potentially looking at. But what I'm really at this moment sort of leaning towards is really investigating this property that, when we set up our institutions, they're set up with formal rules and norms that guide the agents operating within those institutions. But over time, what we tend to see is that we have a formal structure that competes with an informal structure that's either built below it or on top of it, and involves the same agents, but they're operating under different and informal terms and conditions. And this is where, in my research, I would really love to be able to use some sort of analytical tools and techniques to really bring out how these informal structures are built up over time, and how they can be for beneficial purposes, but at the same time they could quickly be built around more nefarious purposes that really lead to the challenging of the effectiveness of that institution, which would amount to corruption under my definition. So this is kind of the area of research that I'd be particularly looking to focus on, is the sort of the multiplex network structures that do get built up over time. And there's, I think, a lot of implications out of thinking about corruption this way and as a complex phenomenon. So number one, it will provide us with a new conceptual paradigm that would allow for a more broader and encompassing picture of how corruption occurs and is sustained. Number two, I think it would really provide a new toolkit for policymakers and anti-corruption advocates. So particularly, going back to my couple of diagrams here, right now, the efforts, as I mentioned earlier, are really about compliance and ensuring that we have codes of conduct and attestation by individuals working for different organizations. But if we think about it in this context of having two networks operating within one institution, there's one network here that we want to continue to make resilient, which is our formal structure, which is the purpose that the institution was built for. And what we want to do is we want to make this informal structure less resilient, right? So there's different ways and methodologies and tools that we'll be able to do that. And this is really where the interdisciplinary nature of complex adaptive systems research, I think, would enable a lot more novel policy responses than what we see today, which is very much a investigate and punish type of system. And then finally, from a third sort of perspective, and coming from the ethics and public affairs program at Carleton University, there's a significant component for looking at problems from a public reason perspective and justification. If we accept that corruption is this complex phenomenon and is emergent, and that basically, in my view, would mean that it is an ever-present property of a social system, how do we, or how should we structure our social systems, new social systems or existing ones, to be able to cope with and manage a problem that cannot go away? Similarly to some of the papers earlier on dealing with COVID and viral spread, like in our society, we know that we cannot eradicate bacteria and viruses, right? We build systems to be able to manage and cope with those issues. So similarly, how would we structure our social systems to deal with this ever-present phenomenon of corruption? And then as well, thinking about also, if corruption is this sort of property that's ever present, what does that mean in terms of our theories of justice? So, and I think there was an earlier speaker that mentioned John Rawls, deontology. So some of these sort of monolithic structures that we've built our entire societies upon are based on some of these idealistic views of what society should be like, universal laws. What does it mean, though, that the moment you set up a social structure, corruption is already in that system potentially? So how do we structure, what other kinds of institutional forms do we need to embed in order to be able to manage and be more resilient against this over time? So these are the really kind of some of the fundamental positive aspects I feel would be resulting from the research that I would be doing in the next several months and years. And I think I'll leave it there because I think I'm close to time. So if there's any questions, be happy to chat now with the few minutes we have left, or otherwise, please connect with me. I think I've left my coordinates in this presentation, and we can connect offline.